By the winter of 1941, Britain's skies were no longer just a battlefield. They had become a vast gray arena where survival itself was tested every single dawn. The air above southern England trembled with the thunder of propellers, and every Spitfire that climbed into that pale haze carried far more than a pilot's courage. It carried the fragile heartbeat of a machine, a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, that could, with one wrong maneuver, fall silent. In those desperate cold years of the war, the Merlin was both Britain's sharpest sword and its most dangerous gamble. It sang like no other engine, giving the Spitfire its grace, its agility, its unmatched beauty in flight. But it also carried within it a flaw, a small, invisible weakness that could turn a victory into tragedy in the blink of an eye. Far from the roar of dogfights, deep within the Royal Aircraft establishment at Farnborough, a young engineer named Beatrice Shilling sat among blueprints, reports, and mechanical wreckage. Day after day, she studied the incoming files from the front. Each page told a story soaked in fear and frustration. Pilots losing power mid-dive, engines choking just as they rolled into pursuit, men forced to watch their prey escape or crash themselves into the ground. It wasn't cowardice. It wasn't human error. It was physics. Merciless, unfeeling, mathematical physics. A sudden burst of negative G-forces could starve the engine of air, flood it with fuel, and kill its power completely. The mighty Merlin, the pride of Britain's engineering, would gasp and die. And once the propeller stopped spinning, the pilot was left gliding helplessly, counting seconds, praying for altitude, waiting for the engine to catch again. An eternity when a Messerschmitt was screaming down your tail. Tilly wasn't a soldier or a commander. She didn't wear medals and she didn't salute. She was an engineer, methodical, exacting, relentless. Her world was one of pistons, diagrams, and equations. She had no interest in heroism. She cared only about precision, about truth, about making things work. Born in 1909 in Hampshire, England, Beatrice Shilling grew up in a world that rarely gave women tools, so she built her own. At 14, she bought her first motorcycle, stripped it apart piece by piece, and rebuilt it faster than before. By her 20s, she was racing at Brooklands, silk scarf trailing like a streak of rebellion behind her helmet. The roar of the engine was her language. The vibration of machinery was her heartbeat. At the University of Manchester, she earned her engineering degree at a time when most women weren't even allowed inside the workshop. By the time war came, Tilly was already at Farnborough, testing engines until their cylinders glowed red. Her colleagues respected her, not because she was a novelty, but because she was better than most of them. Her mind was wired for logic, her patience for error non-existent. When the first reports of Spitfires losing power reached her desk, she didn't hesitate. She understood instantly what was happening. The Merlin's float-type carburetor, a masterpiece in peacetime, was a death trap in combat. It fed the engine beautifully in level flight. But when the aircraft pushed forward into a dive, gravity flipped the equation. Fuel rushed into the wrong chambers, flooding the carburetor. The mixture went rich. The engine sputtered, and power vanished. Meanwhile, across the channel, German Bf-109s used fuel injection, a design immune to such failures. They could dive straight down unchallenged, gaining speed and advantage while British fighters struggled to right themselves. In mechanical terms, Britain's pilots were flying with one hand tied behind their backs. And in human terms, it was costing lives. Young lives, 20-year-olds who climbed into Spitfires with more courage than experience, only to be betrayed by the very engines meant to keep them alive. Rolls-Royce was already developing a new pressure carburetor to solve the problem. But war waits for no engineer. Factories were stretched to their limits. The skies were filled with smoke and flame, and every hour meant another mission flown, another life risked. Britain couldn't afford to wait for perfection. It needed a fix. Fast, simple, and immediate. Something that could be installed on muddy airfields by tired hands and dim lantern light. Tilly saw the solution where others saw a wall. She didn't need to redesign the Merlin. She only needed to tame it. Somewhere between the carburetor's inlet and its float chamber lay a narrow window, a small point of control. If she could restrict the surge of fuel just enough to prevent flooding, but not so much that the engine starved, she could change everything. The idea came not from inspiration, but from the quiet rhythm of logic. A washer, a small, unremarkable disc of brass drilled with a perfect measured hole at its center. A restrictor no larger than a coin, simple, elegant, and utterly effective. It didn't look like innovation, but inside that tiny circle of metal lay the difference between life and death. By early 1941, her team at Farnborough was testing prototypes. They bolted them to bench-mounted Merlins, simulated dives, and watched the fuel flow. When the test results came back, the room fell silent. Even under brutal negative G, the engines kept running. Smooth, constant, unflinching. It worked. They installed it on a Spitfire and sent it skyward. The pilot rolled into a steep dive, braced for the familiar sputter. But the engine sang on. No stall, no silence. Just power. The device was officially named the RAE Restrictor, but the men who flew with it gave it another name. Half crude, half affectionate. Miss Shilling's Orifice. A strange title, but one spoken with reverence and gratitude. Tilly didn't stay in her office. She packed the restrictors herself, loaded them into a small van, and drove from base to base across the country. From Biggin Hill to Tangmere, from Duxford to Debden. She arrived in her grease-stained coveralls, hair tied back, sleeves rolled, working beside the mechanics, fitting each washer by hand. She wasn't there for fame. She was there to save lives, and it worked. Pilots who had once been forced to roll their Spitfires upside down before diving could now push the stick forward and dive straight, just like the Germans. The change was immediate and revolutionary. Where there had been hesitation, there was confidence. Where there had been caution, there was now aggression. A 50-cent washer had leveled the skies. Morale shifted almost overnight. RF pilots began to fly with a new edge, not reckless but free. Dogfights grew fiercer, victories more frequent. The Spitfire and Hurricane finally fought on even terms with the Bf-109. The machine that had once betrayed its pilot now stood by him faithfully. Yet the true brilliance of Tilly's work wasn't just mechanical, it was deeply human. In a war dominated by names like Churchill and Dowding, she remained almost invisible. But her contribution was immense. She didn't save a plane or a squadron. She saved confidence itself, the invisible spirit that made the RAF believe it could win. By the summer of 1941, the Luftwaffe's advantage in dive attacks had vanished. The tide in the skies began to turn. British squadrons that had fought defensively began to hunt their enemies. Every dive, every maneuver, every dogfight carried within it the quiet legacy of one woman's engineering insight. Eventually, her restrictor was replaced by newer carburetors. But that small washer remained a bridge, a symbol of resourcefulness under fire, of ingenuity born from urgency. Beatrice "Tilly" Shilling never sought recognition. When reporters tried to celebrate her after the war, she shrugged off praise. "I just did my job," she said. And perhaps that was true, but few jobs ever meant so much. Some said she saved 2,000 pilots. Others said she saved the Spitfire. But in truth, she saved something larger, the courage of an entire air force. As the war spread to Africa, Europe and beyond, the Spitfires that chased V-1s over Kent and escorted bombers across France still carried, in spirit, the legacy of that tiny brass washer. After the war, Tilly moved on to test jet engines and high-speed aircraft. She received honors, yes, but never the fame that matched her impact. Yet her name lived on in whispers among veterans, a quiet legend told between those who had once trusted their lives to a machine she had made safe. Because within that small ring of brass, drilled by hand and fitted with precision, lay something far greater than metal and math. It was courage. It was clarity. It was proof that brilliance can be humble, that heroes can wear overalls instead of uniforms. And for every pilot who once dove through cannon fire, leveled his wings and came home alive, there was a small, unseen circle of brass between him and oblivion. That was Beatrice "Tilly" Shilling's victory. Not in the headlines, not in the medals, but in the steady hum of an engine that no longer failed. A triumph of mind over chaos, a symbol of how one determined soul, armed with nothing but logic and grit, helped keep Britain's skies free.